Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the BronsCast. And in case you didn't know, the BronsCast is a podcast by myself, Dave Brons, and I'm looking to encourage guitar players who want to be more creative, who want to do more composition, to get involved in finding their own voice and putting their own music out there. And the reason for that is just because the thing I get asked most often is, how do you go beyond from jamming over backing tracks to making your own compositions. So last episode, in episode 1, we looked at the struggle of composing, and we talked about focusing on the process and not the end result, and just to really get busy being creative and not worrying so much about what the end result is. This week we're looking about another area that I think really trips up a lot of guitar players who are looking to compose, and that is the whole originality thing. You know, this isn't original, is it derivative, am I being a rip-off or whatever. So before we get into all that, I mean, what I'd love for you guys to do is, if you're finding these podcasts helpful, to share them or with some of your guitar playing friends or your musician friends, and also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. That'd be absolutely fantastic. So, right, let's get into today's topic. So, the quote I want to talk about is, "A good composer does not imitate, he steals." Let me say that again. A good composer does not imitate, he steals. Now, this quote is attributed to Stravinsky. And Stravinsky was a Russian composer in the 20th century. And he was really, really ahead of his time, and so much ahead of his time that when he composed, his famous composition, which is called "The Rite of Spring," was first performed, there were actual riots. So it's really interesting to me that he, of all people, somebody who's so innovative, so ahead of his time, came up with this quote: "A good composer does not imitate, he steals." And we're going to just, on this BronsCast, look into what that's all about and try and make sense of that. So before we get into the quote, I want to start with a story, a little story. Basically, in 1997, there's a guitar player, and this guitar player worked really hard in putting an EP out, a few songs, and circulated, and loads of hard work went into it. Money was spent in hiring a studio and composing it all. And full of enthusiasm, he started sending his demo around to various reviewers, showing it to his friends, showing it to his guitar playing friends. And in the end, the comment that came back is, "Well, the music's okay, but it's really just a Steve Vai rip-off. It's derivative." And so derivative means basically sounds like, too much like something else. It's not original, is what they're saying. Okay, so it's 1997, and that guitar player actually was me. And I was at university, and I recorded a demo, really looking to get away from studying languages and doing music, and I just wanted to express myself, really, and I'd never written anything really before, and that feedback just really crushed me. Although looking at it now, it's kind of funny. I mean, I had an Ibanez Universe guitar. I don't know if you can see it on the wall there, which is the Steve Vai guitar. I had the long hair. My band was called Lydian Dream, and I think in many ways people were really justified in saying, "Hey, yeah, that sounds a lot like Steve Vai." And but for me, it was just part of my journey. Like, for me, Steve Vai was the guy who excited me beyond, his music certainly excited me beyond anything else. Like, he looked cool, but the music to me was not just guitar shred, it was really interesting compositionally. And it was his music that switched me on to playing guitar. Like, when I heard it, I just wanted to tell everybody about it. I not only wanted to be Steve Vai, I just, it was something that just really connected with me, and it was my start to playing guitar, and something that's really been life affirming and transforming. That was my point of entry. Up until that point, I'd kind of listened to music, enjoyed metal music and stuff like that, but Steve Vai was the real entry point. So it seemed natural for me to write music that sounded like him. But unfortunately for me, the feedback off the first demo was just really, really crushing. And the strange thing looking back now, almost 20, maybe more years after the event, is that it's kind of, the whole original thing is built on a bit of a lie, really, because we're all byproducts of our influences. And even, you know, those influences can be not just the music you listen to, your family, your upbringing, where you've been, what you've done, the food you've eaten. And if you think about all the films that have been recorded, you know, a lot of them tell the same story, but the thing is it's a different voice is given each time. And I think when you put your music out, it's, even if you're saying really similar things, it's your voice. It's your voice, and if it's you, then it's part of you. Then you don't really want to separate yourself from the things that have made you you. And I think your influences are part of that. So here's the next little quote. So we had the one from Stravinsky. I don't know who said this, but it sounds a bit zen, but it says, "You can't separate the pool from the streams that feed it. Imitation is a good place to start." So you can't separate the pool from the streams that feed it. And I think throughout history, there's been plenty of composers who started sounding like somebody else. So for example, think about Beethoven. He was really into Haydn and really admired Haydn. And a lot of his early work sounded a lot like that. And as he went through, he started to develop his own voice, leading up to, you know, things like Fifth Symphony and Ninth Symphony and things that we really identify strongly as being Beethoven. But that's not just in the classical music sphere. You have guys like Vai. Steve Vai's first album, Flexible, my hero, Steve Vai, sounds incredibly like Franz Zappa, who was his hero. Albeit with a Steve Vai sort of kind of emphasis, but it really sounded heavily like Frank Zappa. And there's other examples I can think of. Malmsteen sounded like Richie Blackmore, things like that. I suppose one kind of story that really springs to mind is Ray Charles. So Ray Charles was a piano player, and when he started out, he was kind of like a Nat King Cole, pretty much a Nat King Cole impersonator by his own admission. But as Ray Charles became more popular, he developed his own voice and almost felt like he had permission to do his own thing and be Ray Charles. But he very much started out sounding like Nat King Cole, which sort of parallels my story of starting out being really influenced by Steve Vai. I think another thought as well is this thing of of imitation being a good place to start. Think about the most kind of famous band in pop music or rock history. It's not One Direction, the Beatles. So when the Beatles started out, if you listen to their albums, they sound just like the pop music of the day. They just sound like any other pop song. But a guy called Malcolm Gladwell in his book Outliers talks about the 10,000 hour rule, and talks about how the Beatles really, by doing over 1,200 gigs in Hamburg, really forged kind of something like a relationship, forged a know-how, and gradually as the Beatles grew and took on other influences and developed as musicians, they became what we know as the Beatles and produced amazing things like Sgt. Pepper's, the White Album and so on. But they started out, again, sounding a lot like the bands that influenced them. And I suppose the main message I want to get across to you, if you're kind of fearful of composing and worried about sounding like a rip-off or worried about not knowing where to start, is that originality doesn't really happen by accident. It's really a journey of trial and error to really find your voice, and that's something that I've found in my story, and we'll get into that a little bit later on when I'm going to show you some of my compositions and reveal the influences behind them and what inspired them, and the bits that I've cheekily borrowed. So yeah, and in thinking about all this stuff, I suppose the question that comes to mind is, where's this thing even come from? This fear, this thing of needing to be original. It's like what I call the cult of originality, and I'm not. I mean, we all know of high-profile cases where people have stolen stuff, like ideas, plagiarism, we call it, don't we? So think of Vanilla Ice, Ice Baby, dum 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 dum. Yeah, the bass line which he kindly borrowed off Queen. And the song was Under Pressure, which they did with David Bowie. And initially he sort of denied that that was the influence. That's not the kind of thing I'm talking about. I'm not talking where you steal about a thing where you blatantly steal something and maybe make it worse. Although, you know, there's always a chance that can happen. I'm talking really about where you draw on all your influences to create something new. And I wonder where this cult of originality comes through. I mean, I remember when I was a kid and listened to one of my favourite guitar players, and he was being asked about, you know, like who's influenced by, and he was sort of kind of saying, "Oh, I'm not really influenced by anybody. It just comes to me. I'm completely original, and I don't really understand how scales work and all that stuff. It just kind of comes out of my fingers." And just remember at the time thinking, either the guy's a genius or it's kind of like what he's saying isn't true. And like, but upon hearing that felt really soul destroying as well, that one of the most amazing guitar players wouldn't really reveal where his influences are coming from. And I think there can be two reasons for that, really, that are easy to fall into. The first is like sort of an ego thing, almost not wanting to admit that you have influences and wanting it to be all about you and not acknowledging the people that have gone before you. And I think that's kind of understandable, but pretty poor form, to be honest. The other reason could be sort of commercial reasons. Perhaps people not, you know, if you've got a brand, you don't want to be associated with another artist. You want people to think it's all about you, and also you wouldn't want to get accused of plagiarism. Perhaps if someone could sue you. Whatever the reasons are, I think it's really unhelpful to this idea of like striving for originality and denying our influences. Obviously, striving for originality isn't a bad thing, but it is if your quest to be original overrides everything. So I've got a little quote for you. Hopefully, it'll be interesting for you. It says, "Being derivative is only a negative if one consciously striving for originality and only originality. Sorry, I'll start again. Being derivative is only a negative if one consciously is striving for originality, and originality only has merit if it conveys an advantage. Seen from that point of view, the quest for originality for its own sake is far more destructive than the quest for a well-made imitation." I like that, well-made imitation. "No one that I know of has anything original to say, and then if it's true, then originality looks more and more like artifice." He goes, this quote, I can't remember who said this, "And too near the centre, your work melds indistinguishably with the wall of cultural babble. Too far out, it is an indecipherable riddle." So, okay, quite a wordy quote, but I think what they're saying there is if you're setting out to be original, then, and you don't hold on to anything that has gone before, so you're going to have to throw out everything, aren't you? You're going to have to throw out tonality, rhythm, scales, if you maybe combine weird, I don't know, Bolivian nose flute with thrash metal or something for the sake of being original. Although that could be quite cool thinking about it. But you know what I'm saying? It gets so far away from who you are and how you express things that it's not really you and your voice. It becomes about, you know, trying to make something weird. And I'd argue that, you know, if you try too hard that way, it just kind of, I don't know, it kind of just seems a bit fake and stupid, almost as fake as copying something in the first place. So that's the thing with the cult of originality. I think it can be a bit of a red herring, to be honest. Because at the end of the day, even if you set out to be like a clone of, say, Steve Vai or Yngwie Malmsteen, the truth is that you haven't lived through the same experiences as them. You haven't been in the same place. You haven't grown up in the same town. So not only is it a pointless exercise to try and be a clone, you're kind of never really going to manage it anyway. Just because you are you and they're them, and who wants like a karaoke version of the original, right? I mean, who wants karaoke sort of, say, Yngwie Malmsteen or karaoke whatever, when you could be you? So I think the main thing is understanding your influences and then trying to put them together. I mean, you think about films, some of these things have been said 1,000 million times, and even the same script can be read like really differently by and interpreted really differently by different directors and artists. So I think that's something to bear in mind. So yeah, so you can't separate the pond from the stream that feeds it. Okay, so John Williams is an example of somebody who's been accused of being really derivative. So John Williams, I'm sure you've heard of him. He did the soundtrack for Star Wars, Indiana Jones, and some really epically, not only amazing music, but beautiful music and creative music too. And so a lot of people say, oh, you know, like the music for Star Wars by John Williams is just basically he's taken The Planets by Halston, nicked some bits and put it in the soundtrack, or he's taken, you know, when he did I'm trying to think of other films that he's done, but when he did Indiana Jones, you know, he'd taken certain sort of Eastern and Moroccan music and stolen that and put it in the films, and therefore he's derivative, and therefore the implication is that it's kind of you know, second rate or whatever. And I really resist that, because I think the music that John Williams has done is fantastic, and I do also think he has an identifiable style of things that he does. And with that in mind, I think when you're looking at your influences and the streams that flow into the pool, so to speak, I think you need to think, what is it that attracts you to certain artists? What is it that attracts you to the music? What emotion or what kind of technique or melodic ideas or instrumentation? What can you learn from that, and how can you use it in your own music? And not just music, films, literature, the places you go. How can you integrate all those influences into what you do? So the question we posed at the start, well, the quote was Stravinsky, a good composer does not imitate, he steals. What did Stravinsky mean? I think what he's talking about here is it's not just taking, it's not wanting to be an imitation of somebody else, being a karaoke version of someone else, or stealing someone's work and putting your name on it. It's like showing respect to your influences, really, by acknowledging them, and you know, that's something that I'm doing now. But I think acknowledging your influences, for me, it can feel a bit of a scary thing to do. You know, I'm not exempt from the fear of being labelled as derivative, and I do have a certain ego and pride to contend with as well. So, you know, what I'm about to share with you in terms of the influence on my own songs, you know, I'm going to be honest, like, it's quite a vulnerable thing. I feel quite vulnerable doing it, but the reason I want to do it is because I want to inspire people from the who listen to the BronsCast to not be afraid to start mining their influences and getting started, really. So yeah, so the quote that I'm just going to tell you before we move on to looking at my own compositions is, the reassembly of old information creates new information. And if you remember just one thing from this BronsCast, remember that. The reassembly of old information creates new information. And that's a quote by a guy called Samuel Werman, who created the TED Talks, and he's a big thinker and a designer, and has done loads of things. The reassembly of old information creates new information. And with that in mind, we're going to really look at how to do that. So how do we do that? There's three areas I'm going to look at today, and I'm going to use my own compositions. Two reasons. One, if I use anybody else's, it'll get copyright issues, especially if I put this video on YouTube. The second reason is obviously I know my own songs and I can understand the process behind them, so I thought it'd be interesting for some of you to see what the thinking is there. We're going to look at three areas: melody, chords, and then what I call tempo feel, or the impressionist approach, where you sort of get an impression of the piece and not necessarily copy it directly, which obviously at the end of the day is what we're aiming for. We don't want to be carbon copies, but as you get more experience, you're able to really assimilate your influences and put them into things without, I suppose, without it being obvious to anybody apart from yourself, which is kind of what happens quite a bit in my music. So remember at the start of the podcast I described about in 1997 I did some music, produced a CD, and I was accused of it being derivative. Basically I never really wrote or recorded much else from there up until really recently, and the song that kick-started this sort of artistic renaissance, if you like, is a song called Star. And basically what happens in Star, it takes a really, really well-known melody and changes it. So this is where we're going to start. Star gave me the confidence again to just get right in, so it's a really important song to me. And what happens is it takes the melody of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star and then takes it from the major, Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, how I wonder what you are, and changes it to Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, how I wonder what you are. And it actually wasn't me who came up with this, it was my little boy who sang the melody wrong in the minor, and I was like, wow, and that sort of kick-started a whole creative process. The other thing that happens with and I will play the track in a second. In fact, I'll play the track now and then we'll talk about it in a second. This is Star from my album based on a true story. Okay, so that was a start. So the first thing to notice, obviously, it's going using minor chords. So B minor da 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 to G major da 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 da. The other thing is obviously the original melody for Twinkle Twinkle is in 4/4, and I put it into 6/8. Da 1 2 3 4 5 6 1 2 3 4 5 6 1 2 3 4 5 6 1 2 3 4 5 6. Or maybe you could view it as 6/4. But basically what I've done is I've taken an original melody there. Sorry, not an original melody. I've taken a really well-known, probably one of the most well-known melodies, and turned it into something completely different. The song develops, and then at the end of the song there's like a huge guitar solo, which is an opportunity to sound kind of more like me, I suppose. Let's have a little listen to the guitar solo. and then the melody comes back at the end. So let's just have a listen to that. So yeah, so there, just the start of just taking a melody and then changing it. So we changed the time signature, we changed the key from major, we minorized it, and then if you go back and listen to the full track star, which you can listen to on the website, you'll hear how that original idea sort of goes through the whole track to make something new. So the real assembly of old information can create, well, it creates new information. The second one I want to show you is a more direct melodic lift, where I've literally quoted a melody. So quoting is a posh word that we use for stealing or borrowing melodic phrases. This is from Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony. So I'm going to play you the intro from the symphony, and the first 6 or 7 notes that are in there I want you to pay close attention to, because I'm going to show you how I pretty much wholesale took those exact 6 notes and then transformed the rest of the piece. So here we go. So this is Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony, the first movement, and here comes the melody I want you to listen to. Yeah. Okay. So the melody I'm talking about is the one that goes da 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 da. So I took that section of notes, and that's the only notes from the whole piece I've taken, and also suppose thinking about the atmosphere, and put it into my composition called Hammer and Nails. And Hammer and Nails really exemplifies this idea of taking some old stuff and making it into new stuff. So what I've done with this one is taken the Shostakovich Fifth Symphony melody and then combined it with another guitar player's influence, a guy called Yngwie Malmsteen. And Yngwie Malmsteen is a neoclassical type, Paganini type guitar player. The problem with copying anything he does is it was done a lot in the 80s. He was so influential that everybody and their cousin who could play guitar used to try and imitate him. So the challenge for me was to do something in the style of Yngwie Malmsteen, but do it in my own way. But I'll talk a bit about that in a second. Have a listen out for that melody. Da 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 da. Here we go. Okay, so I guess you can hear the way the melody starts out as being the same as Shostakovich one, but then it changes later on, and then it melds into this sort of heavy rock kind of Yngwie Malmsteen type thing. So the thing with the assembling old information to make new information is that I didn't want to do, and if I'm honest with you, I can't really do an Yngwie Malmsteen clone thing. That's been done by people before me much better. But I wanted to combine my influence of the love of orchestral and film music with an Yngwie Malmsteen thing, and so doing that, I'll show you the guitar solo where you can hear it sort of sounds like him if you've heard any of his music, but sort of not really. So here we go. Okay, so there you get in that kind of whole symphonic angle, and then the melody comes back at the end. And really, the whole thing of the Shostakovich melody, I was kind of almost picturing the scene, and that symphony came into my head, and I wrote the melody out, and it wasn't until afterwards I realised I'd directly lifted those few notes. So then when I went and listened to it, I was like, oh wow, that's really interesting. How can I turn my love of Shostakovich, how can I bring that influence into something without like note for note ripping it off and then transform it into something of my own? So that's melody, guys. Okay, now let's have a think about chords. Now, the thing for me and chords, well, the interesting thing to know is that a chord sequence can't be copywritten. Just by virtue that in a key there's 7 usable chords, you know, you can combine those in so many ways, but eventually you're gonna have done the same chord progression as somebody else. It's just the way it is, and probably more than once. I write, I'm melodically driven mostly in my compositions. I don't sit around kind of think, oh, you know, start with the chords. I really genuinely, or pretty much always start with a melodic idea. So there's not many examples that I can think of where I would have nicked a chord sequence and put it into my own music. Well, I say not many. There is one which I'm going to show you. But I mean, think about, have you heard the song Wonderwall by Oasis, and then Boulevard of Broken Dreams by Green Day? Yeah, it's the same chords. What is it? I walk an open road on the Boulevard of Broken Dreams. Today is gonna be the day that they bring it back to you. I mean, man, the chord sequence, it's not even in, I think it's even in the same key, could be wrong, but they've taken the same chord sequence and then put a different melody to it, and very different songs. So anyway, so let's have a look at this chords thing. I'm gonna say up front, this is a bit of a weird one for me. This song is off my album Miracle Maker. The last one was called Hammer and Nails. I don't know if I mentioned that, if you wanted to check it out. Miracle Maker started out as mixing influence of a band that I absolutely am crazy about called Iona. And so what you hear on the intro is the influence of the Ullin pipes. So we'll just go through some of the influences first. So it's got Low Whistle, which is influenced by a song, not directly, but a song called Prayer on the Mountain by Iona off their album Beyond These Shores. So I'll just play you a bit of the Iona track now. So that was Prayer on the Mountain by Iona, spelled I-O-N-A. And this is another song by them called Brendan's Return, off the same album, I think, Beyond These Shores. And this, just have a little listen to this one. This kind of features Ullin pipes and guitar combined. And then you'll see why I'm showing you this, as to show how it's influenced my song Miracle Maker. Here we go. Okay, so there you've got Ullin pipes combined with guitar, and it's Dave Bainbridge on guitar there with Troy Donockley, I think, if I remember rightly, on Ullin Pipes. Okay, so what I'm going to play you next it doesn't quote either of those two songs directly. In fact, it doesn't really sound like them at all. But I want to just play it for you so you can sort of hear where I'm going with this. Okay, so you get the idea. So there's low whistle in there, and even though the melody is very different from the Prayer on the Mountain one, which is yeah, but somewhere in my mind they feel kind of similar, even though you'd never know it by listening to them both side by side. It's just like a similar feel. Okay, so then we have when the main theme comes in on guitar. I'm imitating the Ullin Pipes, so I'll just play that for you. Okay, so the melody for my right, let's go to Brendan's Return now. You'll hear it's really different. Let's have another listen. So it doesn't sound really like each other, but when I wrote my first melody, I think Brendan's Return was somewhere in the back of my mind in terms of an influence, and they have a similar kind of feel and tempo. However, that's not the main point I wanted to show you on this chord. So I'd sort of written that melodic intro. I'd written the verse part. Okay, and then I was like, man, I just need a really uplifting thing, a really uplifting idea, and the uplifting idea comes from a song called Loch Rannoch by the absolutely incredible guitarist Brett Garside. So if you want to check out Loch Rannoch, it's an album called Exempt. I'm going to play it, and basically I directly lift the chord sequence. So I'm going to play Loch Rannoch now, and it's just 3 chords. See what you think. Check out Brett's amazing playing as well. Oh my word, so good, so good. So the chord progression there is like a power chord goes B to C sharp, B to A. I mean, you know, it's not really, you know, I mean, about 1 million people must have played that sequence before, but I was kind of heard that and thought, wow, that would work great. And in taking my idea of taking old information, assembling it and making new information, I was like, well, combine the Celtic idea that I've got. I'm not sure what came first in terms of an influence and where, but you heard the chord progression there. Bum, 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 bum. Now I'm going to play you the section out of Miracle Maker, which takes that idea. Now I'll leave it up to you guys to decide if this is a rip-off or or not, but here you go. Okay, so there you had the same chords, but obviously totally different stuff going over the top. Similar feel, maybe. I guess what I'm trying to say with that one is, in terms of taking the chords, is, you know, why not take a well-known chord progression that you love and come up with a different melody or different key signature or different time signature to make it your own. And the same thing for the initial melodic thing with the Star, where I took a nursery rhyme song. You know, you could do that with any melody and move bits of it around, transform it by steps, and change aspects of it to make it your own. It's like trying to figure out what it is that you really like about that. Okay, the final thing I'm going to talk about is this thing of the impressionist approach. Okay, so we've talked about melodic, we've talked about chords. The impressionist approach is where you're not... This is what usually happens subconsciously, where pieces influence you and you either don't realise it until afterwards, and you know the influence even though nobody else would, because it's not blatantly kind of obvious. So I'll give you an example. This one's perhaps not so hard to tell, but one of the first pieces I learned to play with acoustic was More Than Words. Yeah, sure you've heard that. That's me playing. That's not the original by Extreme. So More Than Words by Extreme. Then I wrote a song called Desert Rose. Now, Desert Rose, I'll just play it for you now. Desert Rose is basically this. So you can hear it's a really similar feel to the Extreme song, but it's like a different. It's everything else is different apart from the rhythm. But I'm taking the kind of tempo and the feel. So I'll just play you the intro for that here. This is Desert Rose off the album. Okay, so it doesn't really sound anything like the Extreme tune, but the influence there as I was learning guitar is clearly in that tune. And then later on you have influences like stuff like from Little Wing by Hendrix. You have influences of stuff by Steve Vai, perhaps a song called Sisters. Can't even remember how it goes. But again, another example of where various, like this tempo and the feel has influenced the song. So what's this impressionist approach? Okay, so let's finish with this. I wrote a song called Kai Rohan. And with Kai Rohan, I'll just play a little bit of it. It's influenced by a song called Call It Sleep by Steve Vai off his Flexible album. And it goes like, the Steve Vai song goes... I think that's how the first bit goes. And if you go and check out the original by Steve Vai, it's just a really nice song. And I wrote Kai Rohan for my son, and sort of drawing on that's I wrote this song, and it doesn't sound anything like it, but the influence is like the imagery, the feel of it, the atmospherics of it. So I'll just play Kai Rohan now, see if you can hear the link. if you go back now and check out Call It Sleep by Steve Vai, you'll hear that they just don't sound anything like, literally anything like each other. Although when I was putting this song together, I'm pretty sure that that was the song that was sort of in the back of my mind. I did write the song pretty much in one go. I'm sure that I was drawing on that influence in that song by Steve Vai, although you wouldn't spot it. Okay, I'll just play a quick little version of Stolo, just again show the principle of taking old information to make new information. This is completely different now to all that song and the whole intro and everything. Okay, so that's Kai Rohan. So I hope that's been interesting. So I suppose the challenge in finishing this BronsCast is, what are you going to do to take it forward? The first thing I'd say is, remember that phrase I've said all through the BronsCast, which is the reassembly of old information creates new information. What influences can you take where you're going to, what melodic influences can you take? Chords, instrumentation, and so on. Which of those aspects are you able to take and turn them into your own composition? And that's the challenge, really. Why don't you go ahead and start doing that? Just start. Now you know who you like. Start figuring that stuff out. Write a list. Who are your influences? What do you like about the music? What are those things do you want to incorporate? I think the other thing we talked about, wasn't it, that you can't separate the pool from the streams. That's really important. I think when you get into this, it's important to have a really wide variety of streams, if you like. So widen your influences. Listen to more music. Listen to more. Watch more movies. Go more places. Meet more people, and look at drawing on all those influences, not narrowing it down to a few. I think when the problem of plagiarism comes up when you just really narrow it down to, I'm gonna be like I was when I was younger. I just want to be like this guy, and this is the only guy I listen to. Don't just listen to guitar music, especially. Let's get out and listen to orchestral music and all sorts of stuff you wouldn't usually listen to. Right, so to finish and wrap up, good composer doesn't imitate, a good composer steals. What does Stravinsky mean by that? I think, like I said earlier, don't just try and take other people's work, but acknowledge it. I'm here on this video. I've felt a bit vulnerable doing it, but I've acknowledged my influences. Pay credit. That's why I want you to go and listen to Steve Vai's albums. I want you to listen to Iona's albums, Beyond These Shores. I want you to listen to Brett Garsed and on his album Exempt. I want you to listen to Shostakovich and all these different things. That's music I love, and I'd love it if you guys listen to it too. If you guys want to check out the full versions of any of my songs, they're all on my website, davebrons.com, so you can have a listen to those. If you have any questions about any of them and the influences on them, I'll be happy to try and dig into those and let you know. So, guys, get out there and get composing. Thanks for watching. Well, thanks for listening. But if you watched it on YouTube, thanks for watching too. Take care. Bye.